What happens when the machine that built your town decides it needs the ground your house is standing on? I went looking for the answer in the archives of the Minnesota Historical Society and the Hibbing Historical Society, and what I found was not a demolition. It was a relocation. 200 buildings, including houses, hotels, businesses, churches, and a school, jacked up from their foundations, placed on steel wheels and log rollers and pulled 2 miles south by horses and steam tractors at a quarter-mile per hour down unpaved roads because the largest open-pit iron mine in the world had decided that the ore beneath the town of Hibbing, Minnesota, was worth more than the town standing on top of it. The mine did not destroy Hibbing, it moved it. That distinction matters because the company that owned the mine, the Oliver Iron Mining Company, a subsidiary of United States Steel Corporation, paid $16 million to relocate an entire town rather than simply buy the residents out and demolish the structures. $16 million in 1919. The mine needed the ore. The town was on the ore. The assessed value of the mineral deposits beneath the streets of Hibbing was $85 million. The company calculated that relocating the town was cheaper than losing the ore and less politically dangerous than evicting the residents without compensation. And so, between 1919 and 1921, one of the strangest and most revealing episodes in American industrial history unfolded on the Mesabi Range of northern Minnesota, where a town that had been built because of iron was uprooted because of iron, and the same resource that had created the community destroyed it. And the machines that did the moving were the quietest, slowest, most deliberate machines this channel has ever covered. The mine ate the town that the mine built, and the machines that did the eating were building jacks, log rollers, steel wheels, farm tractors, steam crawlers, steel cables, and teams of horses pulling entire houses down dirt roads at a quarter of a mile per hour in the Minnesota winter. Frank Hibbing was a German immigrant who arrived on the Mesabi Range in the early 1890s, prospecting for iron. He was not a geologist. He was a timber cruiser and prospector who had worked his way across the upper Midwest, looking for opportunity in the land and the rock beneath it. In December 1891, he obtained the first lease to mine iron ore in the area that would later carry his name. He recognized immediately that the iron deposits in the red clay soil of the Mesabi Range were among the richest and most accessible in the world. Unlike the deep underground deposits of the Marquette and Vermilion ranges that I covered in the Great Lakes Ore Boats video, the Mesabi ore lay close to the surface, shallow enough to be mined by open pit rather than by shaft. You did not need to sink a tunnel. You did not need to put men underground. You did not need caissons or compressed air or nitroglycerin. You just dug. You scraped the overburden off the top and shoveled the ore into railroad cars and sent it down to Duluth and onto the ore boats and across the lakes to the blast furnaces. The Mesabi was the easiest iron in America, and it was the richest, and it was directly beneath the town that Frank Hibbing was about to build on top of it. Hibbing founded the town in 1893 and named it after himself, which was the custom of the era. He lived in Duluth, 50 miles to the southeast, but he paid close attention to the new settlement and its growth, and he gave the residents a piece of advice that would echo across the next 3 decades of the town's history. Build the town further south. He said this early, he said it plainly. He could see the ore deposits on the surface. He understood where the open pit mining would eventually have to go. He understood that if the town grew in its original location directly on top of the richest ore body on the range, the mine would eventually come for the ground and the town would have to get out of the way. The residents of Hibbing ignored him completely. The town grew where it was, in the spot where the first merchants and miners and saloon keepers had settled, in the place closest to the existing mine workings, where the streets had already been graded and the buildings had already gone up and the churches had already been built and the school had already opened and the businesses had already invested and the families had already planted gardens. They built their homes on top of the richest iron deposit in North America, and they knew exactly what was beneath them, and they called themselves the richest village in the world. The nickname was not a boast about the residents' bank accounts. It was a geological statement. The iron beneath their feet was worth more than every building in town by a factor that grew larger every time the price of steel went up and every time a blast furnace in Pittsburgh or Gary or Cleveland needed another shipment of ore. Frank Hibbing died of appendicitis in Duluth in 1897. He did not live to see his warning fulfilled, but the warning was there, in the record, from the beginning. The man who founded the town told them where to build it. They built it somewhere else, and the mine came for the ground he told them to avoid. By the early 1900s, the Hull-Rust-Mahoning open pit mine, which had begun as a collection of smaller underground and open pit operations on leases held by various companies, was expanding rapidly under the Oliver Iron Mining Company. Oliver had become the principal operator after U.S. Steel acquired it in 1901, and the company was consolidating the smaller pits into a single enormous excavation that would eventually stretch 8 miles long, 3.5 miles wide, and 535 feet deep. The mine was expanding south. South was where the town was, and the town was in the way. By the 1910s, the pit had encroached on Hibbing from 3 directions. The edge of the excavation was less than half a mile from the town's northern boundary. Mary Palsich Keyes, a board member and volunteer at the Hibbing Historical Society, described what daily life was like for the residents of North Hibbing as the mine closed in. There would be blasting, she recalled, and it was very uncontrolled compared to today. People's pictures would fall off the walls, and the kids in school would duck and hide under their desks because rocks would come through the window and everything would shake. I keep coming back to that image. Children ducking under their desks, not from a tornado, not from a bomb, from the mine that employed their fathers, the mine that paid for their roads and their fire department and their school, the mine that was the economic foundation of every household in the town. The mine was shaking the buildings apart, and the residents could not complain because the mine was also keeping them alive. The same resource that built the town was dismantling it one blast at a time, one cracked foundation at a time, one set of pictures falling off the wall at a time. In 1912, the Oliver Mining Company made a public announcement that was carried in the local press and taken at face value. The company had no plans to move the town. It would be at least 15 years, the company said, before the mine would need to expand into the area occupied by the residential and commercial sections of Hibbing. 15 years. That was the distance the company placed between the residents and the pit. The residents took the company at its word. They continued to invest in their properties. They continued to build. They continued to live on ground that the company had publicly said it would not need for another decade and a half. In 1918, 6 years after the announcement, the Oliver Mining Company reversed its position. The First World War had driven the demand for steel to levels that nobody in 1912 had anticipated. The blast furnaces along the lower Great Lakes were consuming ore at wartime rates. The ore beneath Hibbing was needed. The company informed the town council that the mine needed to expand and that the northern sections of Hibbing would have to be vacated. The assessed value of the mineral deposits beneath the town was $85 million. The mine was coming. The 15 years that the company had promised in 1912 had shrunk to 6. The town needed to move. The mayor and the town council agreed. There was no general referendum. There was no public vote. The elected officials met with the mining company and accepted the terms. The Oliver Mining Company would pay the full cost of the relocation. The town would move 2 miles south to the village of Alice, which had been incorporated in 1908. On ground that the company confirmed did not contain commercially viable ore deposits. Hibbing and Alice would consolidate into a single municipality. The buildings would be moved physically, not demolished. The people could keep their homes, their businesses, their churches. They would simply be standing in a different place. Not everyone agreed. The merchants of North Hibbing objected vocally. They had put substantial money into their storefronts, their inventories, their commercial properties. They were not confident that a relocated business district would attract the same customers. They had built their businesses in a specific location, near specific streets, near specific foot traffic, and moving the building did not move the location. The location was staying where it was. The building was going somewhere else. Several merchants refused to move. They were eventually compelled by the terms of the consolidation and by the reality that the mine was coming whether they moved or not. If your family lived on the Mesabi Range, if your grandparents worked the open pits at Hibbing or Virginia or Eveleth or Chisholm or Biwabic, if there is a photograph in your family's collection of a house on wheels being pulled down a dirt road by a team of horses, subscribe if you want to see what I find next. The infrastructure for the new town site was built throughout 1919. Streets were surveyed and graded, water lines were laid, sewer connections were run, electrical service was extended south from the existing grid. Foundation pads were poured or staked at the new addresses. And then the machines went to work. The process of moving a building in 1919 was not complicated in concept. It was extraordinary in execution. Each building was first disconnected from every utility that tied it to the ground. Water lines were cut, sewer lines were capped, electrical wires were disconnected, gas lines, if any, were disconnected. Then workers dug beneath the foundation and installed heavy timber beams called cribbing under the floor joists and sill plates of the structure. Industrial building jacks, the same screw-driven mechanical jacks used in railroad bridge work and heavy construction, were positioned at intervals beneath the cribbing. The jacks were turned simultaneously, a quarter turn at a time, by crews working in coordination, lifting the building off its foundation in increments of a fraction of an inch. The building rose, an inch, 2 inches, 6 inches, a foot. Enough clearance to slide additional timber and steel beams underneath, creating a temporary platform. Log rollers, heavy cylindrical timber sections, 10 to 12 inches in diameter and 8 to 10 feet long, were placed beneath the platform in parallel rows, forming a rolling surface. Steel wheels, salvaged in some cases from retired railroad rolling stock, were positioned under the heavier structures. The building was now sitting on a mobile platform of timber, steel, and logs, resting on the ground, no longer attached to any foundation, ready to move. The pulling was done by teams of horses for the smaller buildings and by steam crawlers for the larger ones. A steam crawler was a steam-powered tracked tractor, a machine developed for the logging industry in the cut-over forests of the upper Midwest, heavy enough to generate the traction required to drag a building down an unpaved road and powerful enough to maintain forward motion on grades and through soft ground. Steel cables, run from the crawler or the horse team to the building's frame, transferred the pulling force. The crawler moved forward, the cable tightened. The building began to slide along the log rollers the way a boat slides down a slipway, slowly, deliberately, with the entire structure groaning and creaking as it adjusted to the stresses of movement. Workers walked alongside the building, removing the rollers from the rear as the structure passed over them and carrying them to the front, laying them down in the path ahead, in a continuous leapfrogging process that kept the building on a rolling surface for the full 2-mile journey. The speed was roughly a quarter mile per hour. At that rate, assuming continuous movement without stops, the 2-mile trip took 8 hours. In practice, it took longer because the roads were unpaved, the ground conditions varied with the weather, the log rollers jammed in soft soil, the buildings shifted on their platforms and had to be re-leveled, and every intersection, every turn, every bridge, every ditch required the pulling crew to stop, reposition the cables, and adjust the path. In winter, the frozen ground provided a firmer surface, which made the pulling easier, but the cold made the labor brutal, and the short daylight hours limited the working time. In spring and fall, the ground thawed and softened and the buildings sank into the mud, sometimes requiring hours of jacking and re-rollering to get them moving again. 185 houses were moved this way, 20 businesses. Some of the larger commercial buildings, including hotels and multi-story structures, were too wide or too tall to move intact on the available roads. They were cut in half. The building was literally sawed through the middle vertically using hand saws and cross-cut saws, separating the structure into 2 sections. Each half was then jacked up, placed on its own set of rollers and wheels, pulled separately down the road, positioned on the new foundation, and reconnected. The seam between the halves was replastered, reframed, and made whole. The building resumed its function as if it had never been divided. The Hotel Hibbing was one of the structures cut and moved in sections. Its patrons slept in it before the move and slept in it after the move. The bed was the same, the room was the same, the building was the same building, the view from the window was different. The move took roughly 2 years, from 1919 to 1921, though some sources extend it to 1923 when the last construction on the new town site was completed. 6 blocks of Old North Hibbing, the blocks closest to the mine, were not relocated. They were demolished. The ground beneath them was absorbed into the pit. Those streets, where the blasting had shaken the foundations and the children had ducked under their desks and Frank Hibbing had told the original settlers to build further south, became part of the excavation. But before the building started moving, in 1914, a man named Carl Eric Wickman was standing in Hibbing with a problem. Wickman was a Swedish immigrant born in 1887 who had worked as a drill operator in the iron mines. He had been laid off. He tried to sell cars. He had acquired a Hupp-mobile dealership, a 7-passenger touring car made by the Hupp Motor Car Company of Detroit. He could not sell the car. The miners of Hibbing could not afford a new automobile, so Wickman did something else with it. He started driving miners from Hibbing to Alice, the small village 2 miles south where some of the miners lived. 15 cents for a one-way trip, 25 cents for a round trip. He stuffed 18 miners into a 7-passenger car and made $2.25 on his first run. The route was 2 miles long. Hibbing to Alice, the same 2 miles that the entire town would travel, building by building, 5 years later. The distance that the mine created between the ore and the safe ground, the distance that the miners had to walk every day to get to work. Wickman turned that distance into a business. His partner Andrew, known as Bus Andy Anderson, joined him. They added vehicles. They added routes. By the end of World War I, Wickman had 18 buses. By the 1920s, the company had merged with competitors and expanded across the upper Midwest. In 1929, it was renamed the Greyhound Corporation. Greyhound Lines, the largest intercity bus company in America, was born on the 2-mile road between a mine that needed ore and a town that was in the way. The distance that the mine created by pushing the town south became the route that launched an industry. The first bus company in the United States was not a response to a market opportunity. It was a response to a mine that had moved to town, or was about to, and the miners needed a way to get to work across the gap. The mine ate the town. The distance created the bus. The bus became Greyhound. Everything on the Mesabi Range connects. The iron beneath the ground drove every decision above it. The Oliver Mining Company did not simply move the buildings and walk away. Having displaced the town, the company assumed responsibility for making the new town livable. It funded the construction of an entirely new commercial district on East Howard Street, designed and built as a planned replacement for the business district the residents had left behind. The East Howard Street Commercial Historic District was later listed on the National Register of Historic Places as a representative example of a corporate planned community relocation, a category of National Register listing that is not common because corporate planned community relocations are not common. Hibbing is the largest American town ever physically moved to accommodate a mine, and then the company built them a high school. The Hibbing High School, completed in 1923 at a cost of approximately $3.9 million, which is the equivalent of roughly $70 million in current dollars, was not a normal public high school. It was, and remains, the most extravagant public high school building in the United States. Cut crystal chandeliers hang from the ceilings of the main corridors. The hallways are lined with marble and polished stone. The auditorium, which the residents call the Little Carnegie, seats 1,800 people and features a ceiling of hand-painted Belgian linen, an orchestra pit, a pipe organ, and acoustics that were designed by engineers who had worked on concert halls. Oil paintings hang in the common areas. The library is paneled in dark wood with built-in reading alcoves. The swimming pool is full-sized competition regulation. The building was designed by the architects Holstead and Sullivan, who were told to build something that a mining town on the Mesabi Range would be proud of, and what they built was a building that would not look out of place on a university campus or in a major city. I spent a long time with the high school because it explains something about the economics of displacement that appears in a different form in every video on this channel. The mining company uproots an entire town because it wants the ore beneath the streets. It pays $16 million to move 200 buildings. It builds a new commercial district. And then it builds the displaced residents the most expensive high school in the country, with crystal chandeliers and hand-painted Belgian linen and a pipe organ in the auditorium. The high school was compensation. It was the visible, tangible, daily reminder that the company had taken the town's ground and given it something beautiful in return. The chandeliers were the company's way of saying, "We know what we did and we paid for it, and the payment is hanging above your children's heads every morning when they walk to class." It was the crystal chandelier version of Ford's $5 day. A payment large enough and spectacular enough to make the recipients feel that what they had lost was worth what they had gained, or at least tolerable, or at least something they could point to when outsiders asked why they had allowed a mining company to pick up their town and carry it down the road. One of the students who walked under those chandeliers was a boy named Robert Allen Zimmerman, who attended Hibbing High School in the late 1950s, and who would later change his name to Bob Dylan. Another was Kevin McHale, who became one of the greatest power forwards in the history of professional basketball. Another was Roger Maris, who held Major League Baseball's single-season home run record for 37 years. Another was Vincent Bugliosi, who prosecuted Charles Manson and later wrote Helter Skelter. The high school that the mining company built to compensate the town it had displaced produced some of the most famous Americans of the 20th century. The mine made the school necessary. The school made the careers possible. The ORE beneath the town funded both the displacement and the compensation and the education and the futures that grew from it. The Hull-Rust-Mahoning mine is still operating today. It is still the largest open-pit iron mine in the world by cumulative volume of material removed. More than 1.4 billion tons of earth have been excavated from the site since mining began. Over 800 million tons of iron ore have been shipped from the complex to the blast furnaces of the lower Great Lakes. At peak production during World War II, roughly 1/4 of all the iron ore mined in the entire United States came from this single pit. The ore that fed the blast furnaces at Carnegie's Edgar Thomson and Braddock, the ore that was carried across the Great Lakes by the ships that sank in November, the ore that was poured into the Bessemer converters and the open hearth furnaces and rolled into the rails and the beams and the cables and the plates that built the bridges and the skyscrapers and the battleships and the railroad cars, a significant fraction of all that ore came from beneath the ground where the town of Hibbing had been standing before the mine ate it. The pit today covers 5,000 acres. 5,000. 8 miles long, 3.5 miles wide, 535 feet deep. You can stand at the Hull-Rust mine view, overlook on the north edge of the relocated Hibbing, and look out over the rim and see the terraced walls of the excavation descending into the earth in concentric steps, the haul roads switching back and forth across the faces like the ramps of an enormous parking garage, the trucks at the bottom looking no bigger than insects from the viewing platform. The scale is difficult to absorb. The pit is wider than the Grand Canyon at most points. They call it the Grand Canyon of the North, and the comparison is not exaggerated. Old North Hibbing is gone. The 6 blocks absorbed into the mine are now part of the excavation. The streets where the buildings once stood, where the families had lived, where the children had walked to school, where the pictures fell off the walls when the blasting shook the earth, where Frank Hibbing had told the first settlers to build further south and they had not listened. Those streets are now open air above a hole in the ground that is 535 feet deep and getting deeper. The ground that held the houses holds nothing now. The ore has been extracted. The rock has been removed. What remains is absence, a void where a town used to be. The site of Old North Hibbing is now a model airplane field and a mine viewing platform. The Hibbing Historical Society maintains a collection of photographs from the move, black and white images showing houses on steel wheels, buildings cut in half with their interior walls exposed, horses straining against cables in the snow, steam crawlers belching smoke on frozen dirt roads, and the faces of the residents watching their homes slide past them on log rollers at a 1/4 mile per hour toward a destination they had not chosen. The residents of Hibbing did not choose where they were going. The Oliver Mining Company chose the site. The company designed the new street grid. The company built the new commercial district. The company built the high school. The people were given their buildings back and a new address and a school with crystal chandeliers and a 1,800-seat auditorium with a pipe organ and a hand-painted Belgian linen ceiling. And the mine took the ground they had been standing on and turned it into a hole that is 8 miles long and 500 feet deep and still today producing ore. I started with a question: what happens when the machine that built your town decides it needs the ground your house is standing on? In Hibbing, Minnesota, the answer was that the machine did not ask permission. The Oliver Mining Company told the town it was moving. The town council agreed without a public vote. The buildings were jacked up, placed on rollers and steel wheels, and pulled 2 miles south by horses and steam tractors and cables, and men walking beside them in the cold, relaying logs from the back of the building to the front at a quarter-mile-per-hour, because the ore beneath the streets was assessed at $85 million and the buildings standing on top of it were worth less. The distance they traveled, 2 miles from Hibbing to Alice, was the same 2 miles that Carl Wickman had been driving miners in a 7-passenger Hupmobile since 1914. The mine created the distance created the bus company. The bus company became Greyhound. Everything traces back to the ORE. Frank Hibbing warned them. Build further south. They did not listen. The town grew on the ore and called itself the richest village in the world, and the richness was underground and the village was in the way. The mine that created the town consumed the town. The company that employed the residents displaced the residents. The ore that funded the schools shook the schools until the rocks came through the windows. And the machines that moved the buildings, the jacks and the rollers and the horses and the steam crawlers and the steel cables, were the quietest machines on this channel because they did not explode and they did not collapse and they did not kill anyone. They simply picked up a town and carried it 2 miles down the road and set it down in a different place and went back for the next building and the next and the next. Because the ore was more important than the address, and the mine was more important than the town, and the ground was more important than the people who had been told 30 years earlier not to build on it. America wasn't built in boardrooms. It was built in the dark, inside furnaces under 40-ton weights, and sometimes on log rollers and steel wheels at a quarter-mile-per-hour, with your house sliding down a dirt road behind a team of horses. Because the company that employed your father decided that the iron beneath your street was worth more than your street. There are more of these stories. More machines, more furnaces, more men who went into the dark and came out different or didn't come out at all. Subscribe if you want to see what I pull from the records next. If you want to see how America built 2,710 ships in 4 years, and the welders who built them breathed the fumes that the hulls they were welding trapped around them, that video is on screen now.